Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. Today is June 6th, which happens to also be the 81st anniversary of D-Day. And we are going to be talking about with Harley Schlanger, who is a longtime LaRouche associate, LaRouche's spokesman for his numerous presidential campaigns, and a well-known political commentator in the United States about the efforts of the so-called deep state. LaRouche would call it the British Empire and its various tentacles, to undermine the presidency, which is something urgently needing to be discussed when you look at what is happening with President Donald Trump and his efforts to get us off the trajectory toward thermonuclear war with Russia. And to clarify, I am not saying that President Trump is perfect and flawless. There are many weak points, but the Biden administration was heading us straight down a downhill freight train into a collision for the entire human race. President Trump doesn't want to go that way, but he is being sabotaged by the European leaders. Friedrich Merz was just in the United States with his arm twisting to continue to arm Ukraine, etc. We have the British, the French, the recent attacks by Ukraine on the Russian military bases, the attack on the Kerch Bridge. But President Trump also now has spoken by phone with President Putin and President Xi Jinping just within the last 36 hours. This is extremely important. And then somehow out of left field, seemingly, you have this public spat with Elon Musk, who, after all, comes from the British Commonwealth, South Africa, Canada, etc. Is that why he's doing this? I don't know. I just know that for the British, it is absolutely intolerable that the United States work with Russia and China, because that combination can actually defeat British imperial policy. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Harley Schlanger. Harley, I'm so glad you're here today. I'd like to welcome you to the program, and please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Diane. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss this because, as you mentioned, today is D-Day. 81 years ago, American troops set out from the United Kingdom to occupied France to launch an operation to end the World War II. And it still took a number of months of very hard fighting. In fact, the operation itself was quite dangerous. But the Americans knew that they had a backup. And the backup was the fact that the Red Army had finally turned around the German offensive. And as we now know from what President Putin has been saying, it was the Russians, the Soviets, who lost 26, 27 million people in their courageous battle to defeat the Nazis. Now, what's interesting about looking back on that is that that was a period where there were some people who didn't want to fight the war, but in general, there was a unified commitment because we had a leader, Franklin Roosevelt, who articulated the reasons for the war and the necessity for the war. And people trusted him because he demonstrated courage in taking the United States out of the Depression. In contrast to that, in 1960, when Kennedy came in 1961, actually, January, the military was riddled with what we would call today war hawks, neoconservatives, who wanted to fight the Soviet Union. In fact, were convinced that we could defeat the Soviet Union in a nuclear war. I just saw a quote from a meeting with what was called the XCOM, the executive committee that was set up to advise Kennedy on how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what they were saying, Curtis LeMay, who was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, look, we could win a nuclear war. And he cited this thing called the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, which they were reluctant to let Kennedy see. I mean, here's Kennedy, the president. He wasn't even, he had to send someone in to demand to see the report. And he was horrified because it talked about using 170 nuclear bombs to hit Moscow. And Kennedy said after reading this, and we call ourselves the human race. So if you look at the situation around the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I assume we'll discuss that more, but then look at what's happening today with Ukraine, with the push to provide long-range missiles to the Ukrainians to attack Russia, the European Four Stooges pushing harder and harder for a war with Russia. What you see is today the effects, what Trump is dealing with is not just the Biden administration. That was bad enough. But before that, you had the Bush Jr. administration and then the Obama administration. Three presidents who believe that the United States had to use its military power to enforce an unjust economic system on the world. So when you talk about Trump and the questions that come up around him, the one thing I don't question is that he does seem to want peace, although, again, we could discuss the Middle East policy in that regard. But in terms of Ukraine and Russia, he wants normalization of relations. And this goes against not only our so-called European allies, but the neocons in the House and the Senate in both parties. We just saw Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, a Republican and a Democrat, giving Zelensky full backup as the Ukrainians launched these attacks on Russian air bases. So it's a very dangerous moment, and it's worth looking back in these previous iterations of this struggle to get a sense that the key question here is leadership. But there's a second question. What do the people want? Will the people stand up and fight? And I don't mean to fight the Russians. I mean, will they fight the war hawks who are stealing from the future to wage these useless wars in the present?
Yes, exactly. I think maybe one of the problems, obviously, I think that the American people have is, and I suppose it's natural, which is you want to blame everything that happens on the president without understanding the complexities. I mean, there is a reason why Trump talked about draining the swamp, because you have a group of bureaucrats who have been there. They stay there from one administration to the next. They don't really change. And we see some of these things on the neocon side, like Victoria Nuland, who has been there for quite some time meddling. Uh, you see that with Liz Cheney, right? Supposedly a Republican, but then the Democrats loved her because of what she did with her January 6th commission. And these are only faces that we know. There's tens of thousands behind the scenes. And I think it might be worthwhile to also understand what Trump was handed. One, this policy goes back at least to the Obama administration, really even much earlier than that with the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. But I think Kennedy inherited something like that around the Bay of Pigs. And maybe if you could say a little bit about that and what
Sure.
Kennedy did actually in terms of firing some people in the aftermath.
Well, of course, Kennedy was elected really at a very tense moment in the Cold War. And I think most Americans don't fully understand the situation around the so-called Cold War because they don't understand the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt intended to get at the problems that led to World War II, which was the fact that you still had empires, the British Empire, the Japanese Empire, that were out to loot and plunder as much of the world as they could to protect their own standard of living and to build up their military. And so on the one hand, you had, after World War II was over, we had been allied with the Soviets during the war. Would we remain allied? And when Franklin Roosevelt died, the British moved in full force and took over Harry Truman. They sent Churchill with the famous Fulton, Missouri speech of the Iron Curtain descending upon Europe and so on. So they created the idea of two empires, with now the British Empire in decline, at least physically, but not in terms of its control of the intelligence and control of the financial system through the City of London. So the British, on the one hand, played a very large role. Now, Eisenhower tried to carry through some of FDR's ideas, but he was not an intellectual. He was surrounded by some very bad people, namely the Dulles brothers, among the most prominent. Allen Dulles figured very prominently, probably in the assassination of Kennedy, and certainly in the cover-up of the Warren Commission report. So you had those kinds of individuals in the Eisenhower cabinet. And that's probably why Eisenhower could talk about the military-industrial complex on the way out the door. He didn't try to get rid of them while he was president. You notice that. It
Mm.
was the day before he stepped down, he warned of the dark forces that were embedded inside the US government. Now, that's what Kennedy had to take on. And they had already planned, before Kennedy was elected, to launch an attack on Cuba after the election. So Kennedy comes in as a president, talking tough about the Cold War, but not quite sure how to maneuver. And he's met in one of his first cabinet meetings with a report that they're about to launch exiled Cubans to go in and overthrow Castro. Kennedy was skeptical of this from the beginning, but who would he talk to? Who could he talk to? And what he was afraid of, and this is important to think about how they try to manipulate Trump, what he was afraid of is they would say if he didn't let this operation go ahead, it would show he was weak. He was fearful of confronting the communists. And that may have been enough to convince him to overcome his concerns, because he said, look, I never thought this would work. It sounded like a kind of wild planning. Some guy probably had a couple of bottles of scotch too much and sat around and came up with a plan to overthrow Castro. Now, the military intended that once they landed on Cuba, that the US Army and Air Force would back them up. And that was the plan. When Kennedy heard about that, he said, there's no way we're going to do that. And so immediately the military saw him as a weakling, a coward, and someone they had to control. And what happened is that the Bay of Pigs was where the exiles landed. There may have been a role of George H.W. Bush in that because of some of the offshore platforms of his oil company, which were involved in the operation. So you had a bipartisan committee out to destroy Cuba with a terrible plan. And as soon as it failed, Kennedy said, no, we're not going in. We're not bombing. And that's when this crew in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, centered around Curtis LeMay, but also Lyman Lemnitzer, concluded that Kennedy's a coward, and they had to do the planning and be prepared to push through the operations in Cuba. So when they discovered that there were missiles, and they concluded they were nuclear missiles being planted in Cuba by the Soviets, Kennedy had a quick decision to make. This was on October 16th, 1962. And he was confronted by the military advisors with the necessity to do something. And what were their plans? Blow up all the missile sites, launch a preemptive strike against Moscow, go all out for war. And Kennedy was pretty much alone in opposing that. His brother, who was the Attorney General, worked with him. And later, Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, backed him up. And of course, Stevenson was always accused of being soft on communism anyway. But the hardcore of his executive branch and the military wanted to launch a nuclear strike against the Russians. Kennedy stopped short of that with the idea of a blockade or a quarantine. But that in itself was very dangerous, and it could have led to a confrontation, and nearly did lead to a confrontation in the sea around Cuba. The
I
longest.
think just for a minute, because I think this is really important what you're saying. I think it's very hard for people to imagine the president of the United States being in a position where, in effect, they are completely isolated after having won an election. Because you would think you have millions of people out there who support this president, but it doesn't have an impact on this apparatus, which already has certain plans underway. And I think that's why Trump, this time at least, got a couple partisans in, as opposed to his first administration, where they knocked out General Flynn almost immediately, who was
Yeah.
much more clear on these things. But then you had Mike Pompeo, you had John Bolton, and of course, Trump also felt induced to pick these people. I asked Lynn about this in his first administration. Why did he pick this terrible Goldman Sachs guy, Mnuchin, to be the Treasury Secretary? And Lynn said, well, you have to understand Trump's one of his weaknesses is being a businessman. You pay back people who did things for you. So Mnuchin had raised a whole bunch of money for Trump's campaign. So then he gets this cherry of the post of Treasury Secretary. And I think there were similar reasons. I think, I forget, it was Giuliani or something told Trump he should really bring in Bolton. It's a vulnerability. So at least Tulsi Gabbard and Kennedy, who may have some wacky ideas in other areas, but both of them, I think, are very clear on the Russia-Ukraine situation. But then otherwise, who else is there? I mean, this is really, I think what you're going through with Kennedy is really important.
Well, let me just make a couple more points about Kennedy,
Yeah.
because after the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy refused to send in military support, there were open discussions of how this was treason. He let these people be slaughtered or put in prison. These were the original prisoners at Guantanamo, courtesy of Castro. But Kennedy was very much fearful of the global impact of this, because at the same time, you had a crisis developing in Berlin. The Actually, it was a year earlier. No, actually, it was the same year. What happened in Berlin is that the Berlin Wall was started in April 1961.
Wow.
And so you had Russian troops, Soviet troops, tanks on the Kudamm, the Kurfürstendamm main thoroughfare in Berlin, with their cannon and their tanks pointed at the Western zone. And in a blitzkrieg, they built a wall, much quicker than the Germans build things today. Uh, and so the city was divided. The whole country was divided by the agreements in the post-war period. And Kennedy was essentially being accused of appeasement because he didn't do anything about it. What was he supposed to do? Go in and fight the Soviets in East Berlin? So in this context, then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the military guys are demanding, look, we have the weapons. We can win a nuclear war. And what Kennedy said is, what would be left of the world if we win a nuclear war? And so he rallied with his brother Bobby to run a back channel operation. Bobby met with Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador in Washington. They had other channels, including through the Vatican. And eventually Kennedy spoke with Khrushchev directly. And this is what Scott Ritter was talking about the other day. Diplomacy. Diplomacy. You talk, you don't shoot first. And what they worked out was a deal. It may not have been the best deal, but they said, if you take your missiles out of Cuba and we'll remove our missiles from Turkey that are pointed at the Soviet Union, but we won't say that there was a deal. So to save face for Kennedy, they made it seem as though the Soviets backed down. And what happened shortly after that was that Kennedy went on a peace offensive that included the test ban treaty, that included ongoing discussion, the idea that We might pull troops out of Vietnam as well. And his June 10th, 1963 speech, the peace speech, where he basically said, we are not looking for a Pax Americana, but a peace for all time and all people. Now, I think that played a large role in why he was killed, because he could not be broken by the what we call today the deep state.
Right. Also that speech, the June 10th speech, the commencement address for American University, was the place where he announced the test ban treaty, which I think also shows, in a sense, the president having to go to the people to get around the traitors within his own administration who never would have allowed that policy to get through. I think it's a very good. Go ahead.
It's a beautiful, eloquent speech, because at one point he says, as much as we abhor communism, we admire the Russian people for their courage as our allies in fighting against the Nazis. And then he finishes by the first section of the speech by saying what we have in common. Just like the Russians, we love our children, we want the best for them. We breathe the same air, and we are all mortal. And so this idea of common interests, of going beyond the abhorrence of a system that we didn't like, but instead of going to war, risking the human race, you talk, you work it out. And the fact that he did bring up the test ban treaty at that American University speech and then had to fight for it. And right to the end of his life, he was trying to have symbols of rapprochement, including offering joint space missions with the Soviet Union at the United Nations. So that was an example of courage. Now, fast forward to the period, the current period, and I'll go even before Bush Jr. I think it's provable that the provocation of Russia that led to the special military operation didn't start with the Ukraine regime change coup or the killings in the Donbass. It started in 1990, 91, 92 with the consistent lying to Russian leaders that NATO would not be moved 1 inch eastward. And at the same time, the shock therapy policy, which was opposed, by the way, by some in the US Embassy in Moscow, who said that this isn't going to create democracy, it's going to create more anger against the West. So you had these two factors. You had the eastward expansion of NATO that started in the mid 1990s. But even before that, you had the shock therapy, which created a demographic crisis inside Russia that wasn't reversed until Putin had been in office for almost a decade. So under those circumstances, you then had the Obama administration launching wars all over the world. You had, before that, Bush, you had Iraq, Afghanistan. It was Obama who did Libya, backed the Syrian insurgency, and then the coup in Ukraine. Now, Trump comes in 2017 saying, I want to be friends with Russia. And what happens? The whole justice system, the intelligence community, John Brennan at the CIA, Comey at the FBI, came out with a story that Trump was elected because of Putin's meddling. And they did everything, essentially, if you think about what I said about Kennedy, they tried to say he was a coward. He was afraid of the Soviets. What do they say about Trump? He's owned by the Russians. And of course, they have the equation of Putin as KGB going back to the worst excesses of communist confrontation in the United States. A mischaracterization of Putin, a failure to understand Russian nationalism. And what does that fit in with, Diane? The opposition to nations functioning as sovereign entities that take the concern with the conditions of their population as their most important consideration. So you have a Russian nationalist, Putin, who is trying to rebuild his country after the years of communism, after the shock therapy policy from the West. He's trying to do it. And every time he turns around to try and negotiate security concerns, he's lied to. So this is why we see the problem that some people may say, well, if Trump really wants peace, why doesn't he do more? Well, remember, he was a target of an assassination, as was recently Putin by the Ukrainians. So the same International Assassination Bureau, which some might call an extension of Operation Gladio or various kinds of NATO operations, but it's essentially British MI6. This is a terror operation that is designed to put the fear of God in presidents because they know they can't be protected, or they assume they may be paying for their life if they do their job. So this is why the first term of Trump was so uneven in terms of its assault against the deep state, because the deep state preempted anything Trump could do by going after him with Russiagate. Now, this is why I was very hopeful that Kash Patel would come in and turn the whole place upside down. So far, that hasn't happened. But there are a number of FBI long-term bureaucrats who have had to leave. Maybe there's more planned on that. The Justice Department is still a hotbed of this permanent bureaucracy. And so Trump is up against, and then on top of that, the media. You know, the media is so quick to jump on this Musk-Trump controversy. That's what makes me a little suspicious about the whole thing. Not that the two of them cooked it up or anything. I think that there are real disagreements there. But they're using this as a diversion at a point where we nearly had the provocation for nuclear strikes from Russia against Ukraine. And the US was saying we didn't know anything about it. Trump said he didn't know it was planned. Well, who planned it? Who did it? These are things we have to get to. So at the same time, you have to do a forensic investigation into who's running these operations, and then come up with a strategy for breaking out of the causes of the conflict. And I think Trump is having some trouble with that. I think the bigger problem is that the Europeans have proven to be worse than cowards. They're just immoral idiots. The worst kind of war provocateurs. You mentioned Mertz. There's going to be a rally Saturday in the town where the Taurus missiles are built. And it'll be interesting because among the people there will be what the sponsors are, the BUSO, which is the LaRouche party in Germany, and also the party that's number one in the polls right now in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, who are accused of being right-wing extremists because they're against the war.
Right. Also, it is so out. I mean, you say the number one party, and then there's all these bans, or you're not supposed to work with them, or they can't be part of a coalition. That is rather stunning to me, because that is the extent to which this minority, who's declared themselves to be the elites, believe that they can dictate to the rest of us what we are allowed to think and with whom we are allowed to associate.
Well, remember, the Biden administration had this conference on democracy, which set forward this theory that you have the democratic nations that are good, and they're grouped largely under the power of the sole superpower, which is the senile Joe Biden is in charge of it. And then on the other side, you have the autocracies. And look, they're absolutely serious about what in the past would be called fascism. Look what they did in Slovakia, where they nearly killed the prime minister of Slovakia, Fico. Look what they did in Romania. There was an election where the person who won the first round, Georgescu, was against Romania's involvement in NATO against Russia. And they overturned that election in the courts. And then when he went to register for the second term, second election, they arrested him. They wouldn't let him do it. Then his fellow party member, Simeon, won the first round of the next election. and they were prepared to cancel that. Now, we just had an election in Poland where the hardcore NATO European Union faction lost. Well, they let the so-called moderate come in as the prime minister. So, and then on top of that, the coverage of this Ukrainian war provocation is unbelievable. Imagine what would happen if some foreign power came in and blew up or tried to blow up American bombers on their home base. That would be denounced by the United States as state terrorism after we had already blown them up. Now, the fact that this occurred while two prominent American senators were in Kiev meeting with Zelensky, where the European Union has just voted €1 trillion of new spending for a program called Rearm Europe, which it's going to be hard to do unless they use that money to buy weapons from the United States.
Right.
The ball is really in President Trump's court because he could stop this if he would put his fist down and say, all right, no more weapons, no more support for Ukraine. You've got to come to the table. Zelensky's not going to do that. And Putin has been clear since about 2017 or so what the Russian demands are. And the central demand, the central demand they have is that there be no Ukraine in NATO. And that's been clear from the beginning. And so what the negotiations have to break out of the stalemate. And what it means is that Trump has to go to the American people and say, look, here's why there's a war in Ukraine, because of the Biden and Obama and Bush neocons. And that's the thing that no president has done yet. That's what LaRouche would have done. But that's the only
Right. And
way you can cut it off.
I wanted to say something about the LaRouche case, because as you brought up with the AfD in Germany, uh, this is exactly what they did with LaRouche, in a sense, even more so. Frankly, I think he could have been at least a very serious contender for the presidency in the 1988 elections, if not elected, had we not had this intelligence media conglomerate operation to silence him. And how did they do it in the US? Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche. Today, even now, he's been dead for 6 years. And they try to smear anyone from working with him by saying that we're all in a cult, that somehow people associated with LaRouche are cult followers of a man who's been deceased for 6 years. It's really rather ridiculous, but they play on profiles or the idea that people are going to be concerned about what they think people think of them, and this is, I guess, enhanced also by the social media, thanks to Facebook, Instagram, and all these things. Everyone's very worried about what everyone else thinks about them.
Well, and Diane, let me interrupt you with one point here, because the
Yeah.
other thing they do is they say that anybody who says there might be nuclear war is crazy. There's not going to be a nuclear war. There's no way that will happen. And there have been occasions in the past 40 years where there were cases where we could have had a nuclear war, but for something intervening at the last second. And most important was the Kennedy operation around the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's designed to convince people that there's no way you can get out of this situation, and that they, meaning the people who control this, the oligarchy, are too powerful. And what's their proof? Well, look at LaRouche. Yeah, he had good ideas, but where did he end up? He ended up in prison. Look at Diane Sayre. Look at Helga Zepp-LaRouche. They run these brilliant campaigns and they get 0.1% of the vote,
Right.
if you can believe that. So, and people know it's a fraud. They know there's fraud, but they say you can't fight it. Now, if we don't fight it, then we're leaving the future of our children and grandchildren in the hands, and ourselves as well, in the hands of insane lunatics who are saying Russia's about to invade Germany and therefore we have to shut down education and healthcare and roads and bridges in order to build up weapons manufacturing to fight them. By now they're saying by 2028 we have to be prepared to fight to protect Germany from a Russian attack.
Well, I suppose if you go and you stick your finger in someone's eye or you kidnap their favorite dog, you might suspect that they're going to come after you. I mean, this is absolutely a crisis of the West's own making, as you said, by design. There is no evidence whatsoever that Putin has any intention of, the idea that he could not even have taken all of Ukraine in 3 years. Of course, the Russian Federation could have done that in very short order. That was not the point. The point was to establish a certain principle. I also think that people in the United States underestimate how much the rest of the world actually appreciates that President Putin drew the line and said no more unipolar global hegemon where you just run roughshod over international law. We are taking a stand. You're not allowed to do ethnic cleansing against Russian-speaking people. You're not allowed to have nuclear weapons on our border. I mean, his demands were very reasonable if you have the capacity to put yourself in his shoes as the leader of another sovereign nation.
Well, I've done interviews in the last 2 weeks with stations in what was the one an African network that it's a national or international African network with Al Mayadeen, the
Mhm.
television station in Lebanon, with Press TV in Iran, with PAC TV in Pakistan. And after the discussion, they all start off by saying, "Well, what's going to happen? Why do you think Putin's not responding?" And you talk it through with them. And at the end of the show, they're saying, "We're really glad we talked to you because no one else talks about these things." And you and they're also very thankful that President Trump spoke to Putin this week and then spoke to Xi Jinping. It shows that Trump is serious when he says we can have a negotiated agreement. The problem is you have conflicted people like Marco Rubio, who I don't trust. And I'm
Right.
pretty sure Trump doesn't trust him. You had Waltz, who was there at the NSC. He brought in a dual national, an Israeli, as the head of the Israel desk at the NSC. Fortunately, she was fired 2 days ago. So I think
Oh,
there's a
good.
cleanup operation still underway, uh, but it has to go quicker. And it should be spurred on by the American people demanding transparency. Why are we going to have, and by the way, this is a part of the fight with Musk, the defense budget. Trump said we're going to start cutting, we're going to cut back on this. Who was it who intervened to have a larger defense budget for the United States? We spend more each year on weapons than the next 8 large countries in the world spend altogether. We have bases all over the world. What are we protecting? Is that protecting the American people? And this is where the fight has to come out from Trump, and where the American people have to be demanding that we actually justify what we're doing. And in that sense, that means that we should take a look at how Putin has restrained his natural impulses, the impulses of a military in Russia, instead of flattening Ukraine, which they could do. Ukraine has no air defense system. They could completely destroy Kiev or uh, any one of these cities. They haven't done it. They've destroyed whole sections of the military industrial machinery there. So this is where you see the Kennedy impulse of negotiating, but not just behind the scenes. Do it out in the open. Get this process going. And that's what we do with the International Peace Coalition.
Yeah. And I think that people should tune in, or they will have heard it today by the time this is broadcast, actually, So I'm sorry we can't report on that because Harley and I are pre-recording here. But that I think will have been quite a discussion given who is on there. And for people who don't realize, Helga Zepp-LaRouche began the International Peace Coalition now 2 years ago. Actually, it was before the October 7th attacks and the genocide in Gaza. It was over Russia, Ukraine, and then you had an escalation. So, as we've been trying to prevent these wars, what we've been getting is a series of more wars. And I agree with you, Harley. I think President Trump does want to certainly end the Ukraine-Russia war. I think he also values having a decent relationship with China. I think the fact that he had a conversation with Xi Jinping yesterday, and apparently they each invited the other to visit their nations. And what President Trump reported is that they both accepted that invitation. You remember President Trump's first visit to China in his first term had a huge impact on him.
Yeah.
And I think this is also very promising, which is why I'm personally very suspicious about the timing of this Elon Musk spat. And as you said, the way it's covered, maybe it doesn't have to do with either of them. Maybe it's the press fanning the flames, although I think Elon is certainly has a lot of control over his social media platforms, and he's spewing out a lot of things that are not particularly helpful to the world.
Well, and I think the other point is diversion, to
Yeah,
get people's attention away from you don't want the tension to build. For example, if people realize how close we could be with these kinds of attacks on Russia, I mean, this was the nuclear triad, one leg of the nuclear triad that was hit by these drones. And it was reported that it was an 18-month process of preparation. Well, right when the special military operations started in 2022, the CIA sent in all kinds of units. The New York Times had a big article on this, that they were essentially running the Ukraine war out of Wiesbaden, Germany, which is where we have our German headquarters, but it's also where the United States had its military command structure after the Second World War. But why are the Ukrainians having their war plans drafted for them by American and British war hawks? And we've seen this repeatedly. So the question is not, is Trump betraying the freedom and democratic loving people of Ukraine if he were to cut off weapons and cut off support? He'd be saving their lives. They can't win this war. And what this means is that the real war criminals, I mean, Zelensky is going to have to answer for his policies, but the real war criminals are the ones who come to him with money, weapons, and who knows, maybe cocaine, to stoke him up to fight this war that's killing the future of Ukraine. So that's where the change has to come in. And it requires the kind of courage that we saw with John Kennedy to go against the hawks and against the people who love war and the money from war more than they do a peaceful future. And it really should be an easy sell, shouldn't it? And why is it so hard to convince people that war is bad?
right. I completely agree. And I think most of them think it is. We have an obsession with punishment somehow in the United States as opposed to LaRouche's power of reason.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's an issue. We're coming up on time pretty soon here, Harley. So I don't know if you have closing thoughts or any points you really want to express.
Well, I think if people look at the period since the 2016 election and look at the work that we've done with the Executive Intelligence Review, we've constantly been ahead of the intelligence story. You know, who's doing what? This is something that Ray McGovern just brought up, that the EIR is, to his mind, the best intelligence source, but also the solutions, the alternative, the idea of LaRouche's physical economy, the idea of major development programs, Helga Zepp-LaRouche's fundamental principles, the most important of which to me is that the human being is a unique creature, a creative being, and that any problems that we make that are man-made can be solved by man. To get that kind of thinking again, instead of the pessimism that we're somehow destined to go through one war after another, perpetual warfare, that requires a real personal commitment to the idea of a better humanity. And I think that's something that most of our supporters have in them. But we've got to bring it out in a much larger section of the population. And that's what the International Peace Coalition is involved in doing.
I agree. Also, so people know, the LaRouche organization is now picking up its activity. We are going to be on Capitol Hill virtually every week around the situation. We're finding that people are very grateful to receive our material and our analysis, particularly people who are opposed to these wars, but they may not feel they have the ammunition to fight them. I also want to say, as president of the LaRouche organization, it is my intention to get involved in some of the primary elections. I just learned that Lindsey Graham is being primaried by someone whose initial platform I was looking at sounds pretty reasonable. It would be great to get Lindsey Graham out of there, to deliver him a smashing defeat and rejection of his warmongering policies. So I would like to urge people, please sign up and donate to the LaRouche organization. If you donate $10 a month or more, you will get access to all of the Executive Intelligence Review publications, both the Daily Alert and the weekly, with your membership. So please do that. Thank you for listening. With any luck, we will be able to speak with you again next week.